welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you by our producer, IEJ Media, and our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia. We will tell you more about them in due course. I'm Ray Powell in California. I'm the former military officer. In New York is Jim Carouso. He's the former diplomat. How is New York today, Jim?
Is the last time this year you'll be able to say I'm in New York. I'm off to Arizona Wednesday.
And I heard in the pre-podcast chatter that you are not liking the weather there.
Cold and gray and miserable. I didn't join the Foreign Service for that.
That's right. So that is why there are snowbirds. All right. Well, coming to us from Washington, D.C. is Isaac Kardon. He is a senior fellow for China Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is also, more pertinently to this discussion, the author of China's Law of the Sea, The New Rules of Maritime Order. And that book examines how Beijing uses domestic law, Coast Guard operations, strategic ambiguity, and other things to reshape international maritime norms, especially in the South and East China Seas and the Yellow Sea. So, Isaac, we had the chance to encounter one another at a recent conference in Hawaii, and I was fascinated by your presentation. But for our audience, which is obviously a lot broader than that audience of military lawyers that you talk to, why should our everyday listeners care, those who don't follow maritime law necessarily, about China's Law of the Sea?
First of all, Ray and Jim, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I am now an avid listener, having kind of downloaded a lot of your greatest hits in the past, and it's really an honor to join some great guests. And I think that there is something to China's Law of the Sea that your listeners will be interested in. It's obviously, and it's in line with what I kind of come to as the main reason in the meta sense that we should care about the Indo-Pacific, which is that it cares about you. And so China's Law of the Sea sounds like it's contained to whatever they claim in their near seas. But the reality is there's really only one world ocean from a transport and communications sense. And we're talking about, conservatively like a third of global trade there, and flows of all of the most critical technologies and components and intermediate goods and other inputs that all of our kind of daily life as Americans here or really around the world hinge on in ways that, COVID revealed to some extent just how fragile the maritime order is. Things like Ever Given, I think, are another example. What we're looking at in China is not an acute crisis like those, but rather a long-term kind of creeping change to a system that has by and large served us pretty well. And I think if what we see in China's Law of the Sea is not so much that it's extended by China to do that elsewhere, but it's if other countries start to behave as China does with respect to the Law of the Sea, we're going to have a much, much less orderly system. We're going to have a much less peaceful system, I would argue, and certainly a less prosperous one.
Well, maybe you can describe, Isaac, how China views the Law of the Sea, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which they're a signatory to, and what they expect other countries to do to abide by this, and what they expect to do to abide by these laws.
So China's not just a signatory, just not to be pedantic, but they're party to the treaty. They ratified it. It's supposed to be part of their domestic law. But that sentence doesn't really tell you that much. What does it mean for it to be part of their domestic law, right? And that was one of the things that I really tried to dig into over the course of my doctoral studies and then writing this book. And I wish I had a very, very succinct, short answer, but we could start with signing a treaty for China means something very, very different than it does in the United States, and something very different than it does in any other rule of law system. Why is that? In a rule of law system, signing onto a treaty is going to create constraints of some kind. It may also create a permission structure for doing certain things. But ultimately, in the United States, there's something called the Supremacy Clause. In other countries, there are analogies to this where signing a treaty effectively binds you to what you said you're going to do. It's a contract as a sovereign state. For China, there's just a lot more flexibility. There's a lot more discretion. It's not that it's meaningless to sign a treaty. They don't sign every treaty that comes along, and there is a lot of work that goes into China's decision to participate even in developing a law of the sea, which is an important thing to recognize. They were a major player in the conference in the 70s and the 80s, but also how to bring it into their country. And so what they have done reflects their political judgment more so than the legal constraints envisioned by the treaty or by the law of the sea, as to what can we get out of the law of the sea. And I think some of the activity that we've seen over the now 30 years that China's been has ratified and accepted the law of the sea as the law. I was going to say as the law of the land, but essentially accepted the law of the sea as being a rule that it's bound by. And we see a lot of friction and a lot of tension. And there are a lot of elements of this treaty that they signed that for China aren't so problematic because they're not binding themselves to it. But for other countries, to get to the second part of your question, for other countries that really matters, especially for, as China likes to say, small states, and maybe I'd add to that small coastal states in China's region and some big ones like Japan and Korea, who think of the law of the sea as the best way to have an orderly system, the best way to say, we own these fishing grounds, this oil and gas, we're responsible for, customs and sanitation and traffic control, et cetera, et cetera. It's just like a rational way to allocate it. And what those countries encounter with China is a lot of resistance to a lot of elements of these rules, because not all of them put China in a great spot. And there's plenty more to say about that, but I think that's just sort of the key distinction. Again, not a rule of law system explicitly on paper. Party does not answer to a legal constitution. The party writes its own rules in which it recognizes the role of the law. Yeah. And it uses the law as an instrument. And I think you could think of international law in very much the same way, because they do. It's an instrument that governments can use.
So let's bring this to sort of the really practical, right? So 1982, this law is developed, we call the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And in 1996, China signs up to it, right? They ratify it. They say, we are a party to this convention. And the convention does something that is inimical to China's stated objectives, right? They've got this huge thing that we often call the 9-dash line. It goes all the way across the South China Sea. And essentially, the document, the UN Convention, the UNCLOS, as we call it, it says that essentially doesn't exist, right? Because it says, well, each country gets this 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, and it goes right through that 9-dash line. And so you would think, well, there's no way that China can sign this thing, right? Because they have these claims that go so far beyond these limits that UNCLOS spells out. So what is China doing when it signs this document that they really have no intention of abiding by when it comes to their own seas, or their own claimed seas, I should say?
That is a great question. And you are not wrong that the convention, in its black letters, this treaty document that China participated quite extensively and intensively in over the course of 9 years, and then ultimately decided to ratify. Not immediately either. Many states ratified on the day of in 1982, trying to deliberate it over for a long time. And one of the issues was, the major thing that this third UN convention did, and I'll spare your listeners, maybe you can insert a link or something like that to the history of the law of the sea. It's long, it's super interesting. This is the third attempt of the international community to codify it into some rules. And the one thing that they codified that was not part of the existing rules, that was really a new, that they really legislated, is the way the Chinese interpreted it, is that they made an exclusive economic zone. Now, extended coastal state jurisdiction would be the technical term for all these things beyond a territorial sea. For basically all of human history, at most a territorial sea was what states could control, lawfully at least. But starting in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, there starts to be this idea that, states, by dint of technology, by virtue of the types of fish that they were, fish stocks that they're chasing around the oceans, by virtue of the military capabilities that navies and coastal artillery can bring to bear, that there was some other zone of control. And what we see for China is that this EEZ is like the worst possible new rule for them. And they recognized it during the convention. And you can read the reasons for that off of a map. take a look at East Asia. I know this is an audio format, and we do have video available for those who are interested. But I will just say, picture in your mind the coast from China's far northeast all the way down to its southwesternmost exposures on the Pacific. It is ringed by other countries. Most of those countries are U.S. allies. The U.S. has forward deployed military forces, and many of them, particularly Philippines and Korea. And what China has instead is all of a sudden it doesn't get to claim the full extent of the zones that everybody else is claiming because of the configuration, the geography. Japanese islands, Korean Peninsula, Philippine archipelago, all of these end up, and the island of Taiwan, which we certainly shouldn't neglect, all of these fall in ways that are going to limit China's ability to claim the full extent of an exclusive economic zone. And so when they're talking about it amongst themselves, those of them in the Chinese delegation or in Chinese leadership who were familiar with the law of the sea said, this deal doesn't really look that good on paper for us, but the political judgment was this is good for us from a strategic standpoint. And I'll give you a couple ways to understand that. The first is in Chinese politics, starting in the late 1960s, but certainly in the 1970s, there was a very, very intense bout of radical behavior, the Cultural Revolution, which I'm sure most of your listeners will be familiar with. And it's important to understand that as the backdrop for China joining this treaty. Intensely politicized moment, international law viewed as a completely illegitimate superstructure, to borrow the Marxist terminology that they would have used, that basically reflects the power configurations of the advanced capitalist democracies that they had aligned themselves against so vociferously, ideologically, and politically. And so for China's political leaders, and this is now in the handover from Mao Zedong to his successors, went through a little bit of a process before Deng Xiaoping came into play. They were wrestling with this idea of should we participate in this international system? It's worth noting China was admitted to the UN immediately before this conference had been initiated in the United Nations Seabed Committee. And what they said was, this is a great chance for us to lead the third world. This is a term Mao coined at the time, in fighting it back against maritime hegemony, is the way they phrased it. And it's this idea that from the early colonial days in East Asia in particular, or in Africa or in Latin America, all over the developing world, or again, what Mao called the third world, that maritime powers were usurping their resources, were conducting gunboat diplomacy, were kind of a first come, first served system for all these new seabed oil and gas resources, all these new fisheries, all this scientific research, minerals, you name it. And they wanted to claw it back. And so China found itself naturally supporting this movement politically. From a practical standpoint, and particularly from the standpoint of their regional security, the treaty is kind of a nightmare. So I mentioned that they don't get to claim the full extent of the zones. That doesn't sound so bad, but consider, this is a point you made on an earlier podcast, Ray, when you started looking at these issues in the 80s, i.e. before there was really such a thing as an exclusive economic zone, it was about who put a flag on which reef. And it's not that it had been nonviolent. Of course, the Chinese killed Vietnamese sailors at two distinct junctions, but that it was pretty contained, literally isolated, right? These are remote specks in a huge, huge sea. South China Sea is 1.5 times the size of the Med. And you're talking about features that, wouldn't even rate a visit on a little skiff if you were sailing out there. They're nothing. What happened as a result of the law of the sea is they all of a sudden became everything. They could potentially, from China's standpoint, generate these huge zones. And that's kind of the political compromise that they made. They didn't like the way that this looked unless they could claim sovereignty over all these islands, which of course they already kind of did. It hadn't really become that clear to them what they wanted until the kind of positive upside of this opportunity to kind of fight back against what they viewed as maritime hegemonists, United States, Japan, Australia, their allies, who were kind of hemming it in. And I think that political context is obviously not nearly the same today, in the sense that China's moved from that particular radical phase to a new type of radical phase where they're much more interested, I would say, in weaponizing international law and using, people like to use the term lawfare. I'm not crazy about it. I don't think it captures the specifics and the purposes of what China is trying to accomplish in this space. But basically, it's viewed as a valuable instrument of statecraft because China is now strong. China thinks, and I think appropriately, that as a more powerful state, over time, it will make the rules in some measure, at least more so than it has before. And I think that's where we find ourselves in this moment of intense friction with the entire region. Bears noting, because of UNCLOS, China has no maritime boundaries with any neighbors. Because of those overlaps, all of these island disputes are creating, diplomatic, security, and economic issues for them that we're wrestling with in lots of ways. But let me break here because I gave you a lot, and let's see how they're dealing with the fact that maybe there's some victory that they can snatch from the jaws of defeat, in the sense of the law of the sea also being an instrument that they can use to advance their maritime rights and interests.
Well, Isaac, it seems to me the biggest use of the law of the sea in the South China Sea was the International Court of Arbitration ruling that basically found all of China's claims were illegitimate. So it's a huge loss. And China basically responded by saying, yeah, that doesn't apply to us. So obviating, to me, the whole point of having a law. If you say it doesn't apply, and if you want to enforce it, come and get me. So if I'm a small state, and I depend on the law to protect my interests, the big power says, no, we're back to might makes right. Why does anyone bother looking to China for law, for new law or new regs? What's the point?
I think it's a great question. I think it's really good to capture it from the perspective of small states in the region. We should touch on the perspective of the United States ultimately too. I'll leave that to you guys as the master architects, but certainly from the standpoint of the small states in the region, law is essential. China's former chief foreign policy official, Yang Jiechi, famously wagged his finger at his Singaporean counterpart to be like, we're a big country, you're a small country, and you just got to deal with that. And I think that's how the region interprets China's version of the rules. And, they have somewhat more familiarity with China and how it operates, and recognize over a longer period of time that this international law stuff is really not China's primary field of play. We had this discussion, Ray, out in Hawaii, where we were discussing, law of the sea issues with judge advocates general, international law professionals from navies all over the Indo-Pacific, and in particular, kind of the Anglo-American sort of periphery, maritime periphery, where the Australian, I believe, was it a former Navy chief, offered the idea that, cricket playing nations have a really good chance of, cooperating well with one another in things like maritime law and trade and cultural things, and et cetera, for some obvious reasons. And that really crystallized for me thinking about it. You'll probably know China is not a cricket playing nation, although I'm sure there's some cricketers there. But everybody's reaction, particularly in a room filled with lawyers, is to kind of clutch your pearls a little bit and say, that's not cricket. The stuff they're doing is just not okay. And I actually think from the small states perspective, that view is even more acute, but they don't have like a normative view on it. They don't think, the international law is something that's really going to bind China because they should do that, because they're obliged to do it. They have a sense of China kind of as China's described itself, more or less, as using law as an instrument to control them. And they're trying to re-seize that kind of sovereign interest, as it were, by invoking the law of the sea. And I think in a constructive way, the law of the sea does provide that common language, and it does allow you to play cooperatively, play cricket with your teammates, and collectively, it should be much more effective. And let me come to the South China Sea arbitration, the 9-dash line. You guys have both brought it up, and I'm wary of getting too in the weeds on it, but what I will say is that you're 100% right, Jim. That South China Sea arbitration under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, basically delegitimized the 9-dash line as a maritime claim altogether. It did not, importantly, have anything to say about whether China's sovereignty claims over all these rocks and reefs and underwater features and artificial islands and all these things are legitimate, nor could it. That's one of the strengths and weaknesses of international law, is that if it offers rules and constraints that are going to impinge so severely on a state's national security interests or core interests, and there's no enforcement mechanism, it's not going to be a useful institution. What the law of the sea, I think, kind of elegantly does in some ways is basically just says sovereignty is another matter. And it allows this possibility of, setting aside things that are much, much more associated with, nationalism and strong passions and potential for war, and making it a kind of boring discussion about the rules. When China's claims to maritime rights over all the water, as you said, Ray, it used to just be a contest for who puts a flag in it. Now we're talking about basically the entire water column in the South China Sea, 80% of it, at least. It just can't, it's just not cricket. It can't fit with a system that's assigning coastal states rights. Those coastal state rights are presumed to exist. And then if there's some reason that an opposing state has a rival claim, then there are methods for dealing with it, including an arbitration. From China's standpoint, as you'll all know, and certainly regional observers know quite well, they gave two big double fingers to the South China Sea arbitration and seemingly to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, right? And I think that's a reasonable way to interpret it. And yet, if you read what they said and how they've, not just how they talked, but how they walked the walk subsequently, they continued to work from, by all accounts, very constructively within the law of the sea system elsewhere, including in deep seabed mining and environmental issues and scientific issues, you name it, preservation of historic this, that, and the other thing. What they said was, these guys are stepping outside their jurisdiction. They're going after our sovereignty. And they kind of discovered a sort of get out of jail free card. That's also part of this law of the sea treaty. Like I said, it avoids trying to make very, very extreme claims on China. And what they've realized over time with the 9-dash line is that you can really get away with a lot. It seems like UNCLOS should constrain you. But if you make very ambiguous claims, and most importantly, if you develop the capability to start to effectively control that space, to enforce your domestic law, to prevent others from using the space, that, this ultimately, from China's perspective, can be reconciled with the law of the sea. And I think that's kind of the key conclusion that we need to draw from this idea that they would just leave a system that, of course, the United States is not even in, and allow the small states to conspire against it, where it can actually work from within the system and just make the rules less effective, make them serve China's interests. And that's sort of the unenviable space that we're in now in the region, and I would say across the Indo-Pacific.
So let's talk about some of the things that China has been doing recently and put it in the context of how they're looking at law and law's place, right? So most significantly, perhaps in the very, very recent past, they've been establishing kind of an exclusion zone around Scarborough Shoal. So now, there are all of these ships, Coast Guard ships, maritime militia ships, essentially patrolling about a 30 nautical mile radius around Scarborough Shoal. And as some of our listeners may know, territorial sea, even if you grant China possession of Scarborough Shoal as a rock under international law, its earned territorial sea would be 12 nautical miles. But China has pushed that out to 30 or so, 25, 30, and is enforcing that pretty aggressively. So impeding essentially the Philippines' freedom of navigation even out that far. And then it's done these other things. It's drawn what we call straight baselines around the shoal and said this is all China's territory. And then it's declared part of it to be a nature reserve. What is the point of all of this? Is this all about law, or the term you don't like, lawfare? Is this all about gaslighting, getting everybody to doubt the reality? What is it? What is it they're trying to do there?
I think it's to put it simply, I think they're using the law as an instrument to assert greater control over the space. It's not the only instrument. You're talking about, all the Coast Guard vessels and all the other things that go into it, but those are all kind of organized in line with this idea that China can claim certain rights, even if they seem totally outrageous from the standpoint of, the black letters of the treaty, and then keep saying it. So there's an element of, yeah, I suppose gaslighting is a accessible term for it. But I think what China would correctly say is that what they're really trying to do is reshape the Philippines and by extension other states' understanding of what the rules can and can't do for them. For China, in some ways, those rules, the law of the sea, are something that small states can exercise against them because the United States backs them up. And they feel this especially so in the Philippines case, and you see that at Scarborough, and we should talk about that in some more detail. That 30 nautical mile line is really is extraordinary, and I think that's an example of kind of the operational Coast Guard side of things, maybe running ahead of where they've thought through their maritime claims. But we've seen that over and over again, which is that because the law is not viewed as really that constraining, they'll continue to finesse and massage and adjust their views. One of the results of China getting its 9-dash line so resoundingly smacked down by the South China Sea Arbitral Tribunal is that they started emphasizing other elements of their claims too. It's kind of like a pants and suspender model. They have both the outside-in claims of the 9-dash line and whatever its nebulous historic rights claims. They have the inside-out ones of what's sometimes called the four Shahs, or each of the archipelagos that China purports to claim. Those archipelagos in quotes for those listening, purports to claim, and then projecting those big exclusive economic zones out of it. And so they've emphasized some of that more. But really what they've done in terms of, watching how they walk rather than how they talk is they put a lot more steel into all of these spaces just in the short decade since that South China Sea arbitration too. And so it's more like, the arbitration resoundingly denied that the 9-dash line alone could be the source of China's maritime rights. So now they're doing a little bit more of the inside out stuff. They are making more specific their claim to Scarborough Shoal. For a long time, people thought Scarborough Shoal was part of some nebulous entity called Zhongsha or Macclesfield Bank, because that's how the Chinese talked about it. That's how they wrote it on their maps. That's how they described it in their diplomatic statements. Of course, the only thing that's above water in that Zhongsha kind of area, this kind of central east north part of the South China Sea, that's the only thing above high tide. And so in some ways, China had to adjust and started to make a much more modest claim, but is now using that more modest claim to do things like offer again, like kind of facially plausible under the law, protecting or conserving damaged coral, which of course is really ironic for China. As they often say, it's like the thief running out of the building screaming, "Stop thief," or the arsonist screaming for someone to put out the fire or whatever.
You have to own it to declare it an environmental protection area. You can't do it. They can't come to Yellowstone Park and say, "We're going to build here now."
Perfect illustration. Yes.
Right.
Sovereignty doesn't get determined by the law of the sea. So you can't say, I'm doing a law of the sea maritime jurisdictions thing
Right.
in an area of your sovereignty. At least that's just not cricket, of course. But that doesn't mean that, they're outside of this system. What I would say is they're just really pushing hard at the edges, making it almost impossible for their regional neighbors to enforce any of their claims, their sovereign rights to exclusive economic zones. Most kind of first and foremost, I would think, for most of these regional leaders.
So what would happen if the Philippines or Vietnam used the same types of additional law or additional interpretations you're referring to for their own claim, saying, well, I'm just using the same arguments you're using, China.
Right.
Does that work?
So I think it wouldn't work. I'm sorry to say, and it's because China's matched its. I don't dislike lawfare, Ray. I think it's just not specific enough. So I'd say China's matched its lawfare to its capacity, right? As I said, the biggest thing that's changed in the kind of grand scheme of things since 2016 in the South China Sea is just how much more mass is out there for China, just how much more capacity. And here I'm not talking about, necessarily such high-end stuff. I'm talking about they're really using those islands way down in the southern part to keep all their Coast Guard cutters and fishing vessels on station and maritime militia and Navy should they ever so deign to do it. And I think we're in a position where the Philippines could say we have these extravagant claims. And actually, to be fair, Philippines does have some kind of extravagant claims. Everybody does. It's kind of as an aside, I think is this a PG-13 show? I think every single coastal state's claims to islands in the South China Sea are shitty. They're all kind of bullshit. They're all kind of made up as this idea that you could get a big exclusive economic zone and oil and gas and fisheries, et cetera, evolved. And nobody's really got a leg to stand on. But what China has is another leg. China does have a leg to stand on. Let me clarify that. China's leg to stand on its capacity to actually, what they say, 有效控制, to effectively control or to embody jurisdiction or to, show up, put a white hull or a blue hull, and increasingly now, especially around the Philippines, some gray hulls, which is to say Navy, Coast Guard, and fishing vessels, and just have them there all the time, and that's kind of unbeatable from it's like a possession is 2/3 the law, 9/10 the law. It's that kind of theory.
So let's turn here to where we're going from here, because there remains now. So if you are talking about these things, there is this process that has been underway since anyone can remember called a ASEAN-China Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. And of course, there was a declaration of conduct signed in 2002 that set out some broad principles, including things like we will all abide by UNCLOS and we will resolve problems by peaceful means without resorting to the use or threat of use of force, which seem a little bit like one of the parties isn't doing any of those things, already. And yet China will respond to incidents in the South China Sea by saying the other party is violating this thing that we signed in 2002. And, it goes back to this gaslighting thing. You're thinking, am I taking crazy pills here? I mean, here's one party using the threat of the use of force and violating, this other country's freedom of navigation, for example. And yet it says the other country is the one that's violating the DOC. But when we get into these conferences and all of these people come together from all these ASEAN countries, everybody says, yes, we all want a code of conduct. We're about to turn into a new year, and the Philippines will become the ASEAN chair. And almost certainly at some point, President Marcos will say, we're going to devote time to trying to come up with a code of conduct. Why should anybody want code of conduct with a country that interprets the law in the way that China does? What is the point of signing an agreement with a country like this?
So I won't purport to speak for the Southeast Asian or the ASEAN states that are participating in this. And I'd be curious all of your views. I could speculate on it. But what I will say from China's perspective is it's the journey, not the destination. I suspect it's kind of like that for the ASEANs as well in a different way, which is they just want to entangle the region in a process of discussing what's obviously become, according to some survey polling of elites, like the number one security issue or number two behind Chinese telecoms fraud in their countries, a major issue for them. And so there's some demand for the ASEAN states, I think, to participate and figure out a way to talk to China about the South China Sea. But from China's perspective, they've used this as a channeling mechanism. They know that they need to provide some venue to have discussions on these issues because they're really pushing some of the ASEAN states around. It's important that it's not all of them, and that division is why this is a really useful diplomatic forum for China. And of course, ASEAN prefers for it to be all ASEAN and have ASEAN centrality as well. And so there's sort of this overlapping interest in the process, rather than actually reaching an outcome. Because the more you look at what's been put on the table and just how far away the parties are over, 23 years, arguably because it's 30 years, they started negotiating the declaration on the code of conduct in 1995, and they haven't gotten any further than the declaration. And I would hazard to say that I'd say it's at least 50-50 that they never will, just to put some
That's pretty
odds on it.
optimistic.
And I don't think that troubles anybody very much.
But this gets into the big thing that I think Ray was going for. What happens now? And the big legacy of post World War II was the United States bestrode the world like a colossus and agreed to all these rules and laws and conventions, which basically bound the U.S., the most powerful country in every way, to the same rules as Liechtenstein. That, all right, we're not going to have might makes right. Is it all falling apart? You see the United States doing things which are very questionable in international law in the Atlantic and Pacific these days. You see China doing this, Russia's invasions, clearly violation of all they've signed on to. Does international law matter anymore?
It matters, but it matters less, and it matters maybe in different ways. And I guess what I would say is back to the original discussion on like what does China see in the law of the sea treaty? The idea that the U.S. is bound to the same rules is not really it's not nearly as philanthropic a gesture as we may imagine it. I don't want to gore any sacred cows, but the U.S. went kicking and screaming into almost all of the binding constraints that we had on ourselves, but we negotiated, we fought it through, and then rather than do I guess what I'd say China's doing, which is always not accepting that the compromise you've reached is quite what you want. The U.S. ratified a lot of treaties, and the United States recognizes customary international law as its domestic law. Courts can enforce it. Private citizens have a cause of action. You can take up a claim. Foreign companies, foreign individuals. There's all sorts of ways that the U.S. rule of law system is what binds us to the system. It's what binds us most closely to those cricket playing nations, too, ironically. But rule of law, I think, is really the axis on which this turns. And maybe that's not so surprising. It's called the law of the sea. If you're lawless is the wrong word, but if law is not really the dominant way that your society or your polity is organized, it's not going to matter as much. And so thinking about what the U.S. is doing now, I guess the first thing to say is I don't think anybody in the region has ever had much sentimentality about the U.S. upholding the law of the sea for their sake. I've emphasized for a long time that the key issue should be, and the big overlap between the U.S. and its allies and partners in the region is those economic rights, those navigational rights that those coastal states need to enjoy. But to be fair, the United States historically has been mostly focused on freedom of navigation, and even more acutely, freedom of military navigation to support our maritime order that we think of as supporting our interests. And that, interestingly, China thinks of that as supporting its interests, too, this idea of free-flowing global trade, of course. And I think when the U.S., I think we give ourselves too much credit to think that there's that much more we could do to make regional states believe that the U.S. is pretty cynical about international law. I don't think we need to fight that. I think we can accept that international law is not as binding on states that are strong enough to kind of fight through it. But the United States does that with a lot more trouble because we're bound up by our domestic rule of law system. What we're seeing now, and I'm hesitant to wade too deeply into domestic politics, but I think it's necessary. There's no other way to understand what's going on in the Western Hemisphere, right? From my perspective, and from what I understand to be the perspectives of most of the people in this administration now, before the impending war on Venezuela, is that our strategic center of gravity is in the Western Pacific, to be more specific, not just the Indo-Pacific. And that's really where we need to be focused. And one of the things that's happening now is that U.S. rule of law is less robust than it has been. And our government lawyers, to the extent they deign to even offer a public justification for the strikes against Venezuelan speedboats and the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, are basically saying there's no international law that binds us on this. if it actually got to a domestic court, if any lawyer in the United States were to look at it, certainly from the law of the sea standpoint, I won't read out chapter and verse of all the reasons that it's illegal. I'm not a lawyer and I don't want to get too deeply into that, but just from a law of the sea standpoint, that's freedom of navigation. Any vessel is a representative of a sovereign. Fundamentally, they're on the high seas. There's just no justification for it whatsoever. And so I think, this does a lot of damage to the U.S. reputation. The saving grace is I don't think the U.S. reputation on the law of the sea was necessarily that great to begin with, but I think this does significant and lasting damage. And just to put a fine point on it, I've been studying Chinese coercive activities in its near seas for 2 decades now. They haven't used nearly this much force in any instance. Certainly no lethal force since 1988. And again, not trivial, not that they're not capable of it, and not that what they're doing is not strategically effective. Whereas what we're doing in the Western Hemisphere, I would argue, is strategically counterproductive, maybe to be modest about it.
This is great. Before we get into a discussion of why should we care about the Caribbean, I want to sort of wrap this up and give you a quick exit question. So let's imagine I'm a producer getting ready to produce my next Netflix series, and I want to call it China's Law of the Sea. So am I making a geopolitical drama? Am I making a legal thriller about a heist? Am I making a military drama? How about what is it that I'm making? And most importantly, who plays Isaac Kardon in this, as the lead in this movie?
I love this question, and I hadn't thought about it in exactly this term before. But what I would say is I'd like it to be sort of like The Wire. And I hope your viewers are familiar with that. But the really amazing thing about that show is that each season is like a different slice of this society, whether it's the dockyard workers or the cops or the prosecutors or whatever. And I think that's what I would do for South China Sea. You just had a guest on talking about her documentary on the West Philippine Sea and on trying to resupply stranded Filipino sailors out there. The life of fishermen and people marooned on reefs in the South China Sea would make an amazing series. I'd certainly want to set at least one of the seasons, not just one, a couple of the seasons in China. And there would be, the Chinese Navy, the Chinese Coast Guard, them crashing into one another would definitely be a great episode. And maybe, you could really run with that. And then, I think there would be a big U.S. focus and a big sense that this is like a proxy for this great power competition that we've been hearing about, at least a proxy, and maybe even the flashpoint for some genuine conflict. And so I think you'd want to have it at that scale too. But honestly, because it's the ocean and because it's the law of the sea, it tends to kind of drag in everything. Oil and gas industry, XLUUVs roaming the seabed, snipping submarine cables, you name it. You could do it all.
All right. Well, so I'll put it down. You refuse to ask the question of who plays you, so I'll say
you tell me.
You're trying to decide between Denzel Washington and Tom Cruise. So sounds great. Look, it is certainly a mission.
Denzel's taller than Tom Cruise, so I think I'll take that.
All right.
All
right. Well, Isaac, this has been a fascinating discussion. We should definitely do this again. And thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure.
And of course, as you know, our sponsor is Bauer Group Asia, a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. Bauer Group applies unmatched expertise and experience to help its clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. My co-host, Jim Carouso, is a senior advisor with Bauer Group, and you can visit their website at bauergroupasia.com. So, Jim, one of the things that really struck out, and this is actually the reason I wanted Isaac to come talk to us after I heard him talk at the conference where I was at in September, was I think that we, and again, this is part of the way that we grew up as, participants in the diplomatic space, the military space, is we actually are pretty rule bound, right? We generally think in terms, we have these, in the military, we have a JAG, we have a legal advisor, we have all of these people whose job it is to say, yes, you can do that, or no, you can't do that under these treaties or this agreement or whatever it is that we've signed up to. So we spend a lot. I took law of armed conflict training, all of these things that we think of that China just doesn't think of in the same way. And I think sometimes we make the mistake of believing that they're going to sort of reflect back to us the same way that we think of the world.
Well, as a trade guy, I also noticed when they joined the World Trade Organization, they took all the good bits, then proceeded to violate a whole bunch of other things like subsidizing their export industry, among other things.
Yeah.
So, yeah, China is a subsidiary of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party will do what it needs to do to stay in power. They've shown that all along. But the history of countries that are mighty doing what they will goes back to when Thucydides was writing about what the Delians dealt with the Athenians. So
Yeah.
nothing new.
Well, and maybe there is something new. It's just that what was new is now old, which is there was this weird time when after World War II, this thing developed, kind of around the United Nations and broader things, but we started to call it this thing called the rules-based order, which is this esoteric phrase that some of us who study this stuff for a long time think, hey, that really, really, really works for American interests. And actually, it works for a lot of countries' interests. And we're going to lose a whole lot if we lose that. And now we look around and we're not sure that everybody is still kind of with that program anymore.
Well, what's the opposite of law? It's anarchy. And anarchy doesn't often work well.
Yeah. I mean, anarchy brought us two world wars, or, early in the 20th century.
I'm afraid so.
So,
It's
well,
so yeah, it's
okay.
hard to say where this goes.
So, I understand that you have been thinking about the law of the sea recently. So tell me a story about the law of the sea.
Well, I've been thinking about it, but no, what Isaac brought up was the importance of the arbitral tribunal finding. And I was at State, and the State Department and our lawyers at State, some of whom worked with the Philippines in helping them bring their case together for the tribunal. And the tribunal was overwhelmingly against the Chinese claims, saying basically under the law of the sea, these claims have no merit. So this was a huge victory. And I thought the US would then trumpet that in every way possible to say, right, China, a signatory to UNCLOS, whether we're a signatory or not, we were not party to the case, say they are now required to abide by the tribunal because they signed on and ratified UNCLOS. But the decision was made instead to find a, quote, face-saving way for China to find an off-ramp out of this, not rub it in their faces, which is understandable. Don't forget, this is 2016. We were still in Afghanistan. Iraq wasn't that far away in our history. I guess we didn't want to have the fight. And the Philippines, of course, were going towards Duterte, who had these mixed emotions, and we didn't want to take the lead. But I think we lost an opportunity to really make some noise.
Yeah. Let me throw in my sort of two bits on that. I guess certainly one is the ascension of Rodrigo Duterte to the presidency of the Philippines. I mean, just literally days after the ruling came out was a huge hit, right? I mean, because if the party who won the case isn't interested in the case, this treaty ally to the U.S., what do you do? Like, I mean, Rodrigo Duterte was the president of the Philippines. He was essentially our treaty ally. He didn't like us, but he was our treaty ally. Are you going to try to sort of, as you're rubbing China's face in it, are you also sort of rubbing his face in it? So it did put us in a strange position. It was also, I think, just before we made this change in our own understanding of the world, and I'll say this started with the beginning of the first Trump administration, of China as the competitor rather than China as this prospective partner and in a responsible stakeholder. We were sort of in the last vestiges of that kind of delusion that we were under.
We were also in the middle of the Obama pivot to Asia.
Right. Well, that's true. But the Obama pivot to Asia, never really did. I mean, again, we were there for all of this. As China did its island building campaign, as all of these things were happening, we still kind of were avoiding, hitting them right in the head, with some of this stuff, because we were trying to usher in this future state that just was never going to happen. And so I think, the delusion died hard. It wasn't just the Obama administration, but it was a long time coming. Anyway, so yeah, I think it was part of that entire era in a lot of ways.
Well, we've had a recent guest who told us that we just have it all wrong and China doesn't want much at
Yeah.
all and we just misunderstand. So maybe we're just continuing our misunderstanding.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to everyone commenting on that recent guest, and other recent guests that we've had that have had a little bit of a different view. The particular recent guest that our guest brought up was Baby Ruth Villarama, who did that discussion about why should we care about the West Philippine Sea documentary that China tried to block, which of course took a much more human and fisherman-centric view on these disputes. So we definitely urge our listeners to go back and listen to episode 108. Of course, we want to as always, thank our great producer, Ian Ellis Jones, and his company, IEJ Media, for putting our podcast out and doing all the great behind the scenes work, even as he's running his other business and putting out all those fantastic military and geopolitical graphics that you see on his X page at Ian Ellis Jones. Reminder, of course, that if you're listening to this and you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. That'll put us in your feed. And of course, it helps us, with what they call the algorithm that helps suggest us to more people. So you can find that, of course, on your streaming service. If you're listening to Apple Podcasts, if you're listening to Spotify, whatever you're listening to, please subscribe there. And of course, over on the YouTube channel, youtube.com @IP Podcast, if you want to see our beautiful faces. We're on social media, X, of course, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, all of those. Of course, you can email us, Indo-Pacific Podcast@gmail.com. That's one word, Indo-Pacific Podcast @gmail.com. And we remind everyone to visit our fantastic sponsor, BauerGroupAsia.com. For Ian and Jim, I'm Ray, thanking you for joining us this time. We will see you again next time on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?